بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وبه نستعين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى الطيبين الطاهرين اللهم صل وسلم على محمد وآل محمد. قال الله العظيم في محكم كتابه الكريم وقوله الحق والأصدق القائلين على لسان يوسف الصديق يا صاحبي السجن أأرباب متفرقون خير أم الله الواحد القهار ما تعبدون من دونه إلا أسماء سميتموها أنتم وآباؤكم ما أنزل الله بها من سلطان إن الحكم إلا لله أمر ألا تعبدوا إلا إياه ذلك الدين القيم ولكن أكثر الناس لا يعلمون. يا صاحبي السجن أما أحدكما فيسقي ربه خمرا وأما الآخر فيسلب فتأكل الطير من رأسه قضي الأمر الذي فيه تستفتيان. آمنا بالله. صدق الله العلي العظيم وصلى اللهم على محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين. Last week we began to take a look at this conversation that Yusuf alayhi salam is now having with these two inmates who are in this prison with him. We don't know so much about them other than the fact that they came to Yusuf alayhi salam telling him that, you look like someone who has the ability to interpret dreams. You look like someone who is pious. You look like someone who has a little bit of knowledge and wisdom. Would you mind instructing us what these dreams that we have means? And we talked about why they saw that from Yusuf alayhi salam, what was the unique attributes that he was exemplifying that gave them the idea that he might be someone who interprets dreams and so on and so forth. But we left off last week with these two verses number 39 and 40, because virtually what we said was that Yusuf alayhi salam doesn't answer the question right away. They come to him and they say, "Oh, Yusuf, interpret these dreams for us." Then he goes off on them virtually with this really sort of eloquent description of why they should be worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Every opportunity that he got, he reminded them of God, even when they just went to him to ask him to interpret, their dreams. And he begins to tell them, why is it that you don't worship God? Of course I have this ability, but it came from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so on and so forth. And then again, we left off with these two verses 39 and verse number 40, in which he states, "Oh, my fellow brothers in prison, why do you worship all of these, idols? Why do you worship all of these scattered gods, so to say? Isn't it better that you demonstrate your sense of subservience and submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who is the all-powerful? ما تعبدون من دونه إلا أسماء سميتموها." These gods that you worship, you've just attributed names and attributes to them. In reality, they can't do anything for you. ما أنزل الله بها من سلطان إن الحكم إلا لله. At the end of the day, authority is only with this one Lord. This Lord of compassion, this Lord of justice, this Lord of mercy, this Lord of love. أمر ألا تعبدوا إلا إياه. And He has commanded us to being in a state only of worship to Him. Before I get into some of these ayat and sort of the next set of verses, I want to just pause over here for just one moment. Because when you take a look at the way in the whole Quran that the prophets of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describe God to their fellow communities, or the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala introduces Himself to us numerous times throughout the book of the whole Quran, or the way that the du'as of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam address and sort of demonstrate the sense of devotion to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. For many, it's very different than the way that we are taught about who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is. I know I say this fairly often, but perhaps it's always a good opportune time to allow for ourselves to be reminded that at the end of the day, everything within our religious tradition is sought such that we are able to improve this relationship between us and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I was at a funeral earlier this morning, and I came straight from there, from New Jersey, And when I went to go to my friend who had lost his father, and I asked him, how he's doing, he says that everything that my family has experienced over the last day or so, in reality, it's a blessing from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He's like, I know that it's a blessing from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but it's hard for me to see it at this moment. Naturally, he lost his father. He's in a state of grief, but he realizes at the end of the day that someone who has just transitioned from this world into the next is in the mercy of Allah Azza wa Jal. We call someone who dies, we call them marhum or marhuma, someone who is covered in the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it's hard for us to see that, but we are consistently bound by all of these reminders in front of us. Before we complete the burial rituals, it is recommended in our fiqh to recite that which is known as the talqeen. Talqeen is this last reminder that we speak to the soul of the deceased before we leave them. And it happens multiple times. It's a recommendation. But amongst the times that we recite this talqeen is before we place sand on top of the body. And then the last time is before everyone sort of departs from the graveyard to go back home. And it is this sort of, reminder to the soul of the individual who has just passed away that when the angels come to you and when they ask you who is your Lord, then answer to them that your Lord is Allah. And then when they ask you what is your qibla, you tell them that my qibla is the Kaaba, for instance. Then when they ask you who is your prophet, you tell them that your prophet is Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. As much as we are reminding the soul of the deceased at that moment, it's also an opportunity for everyone who's attending this funeral to also be reminded of what is being recited. So one of the things that we say is ثُمَّ أَعْلَمْ ya fulan. So know, and then you say the name of the individual. Inna Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala ni'ma Rabb. That your Lord, this God of power and magnanimity, He is the best of Lords. وَأَنَّ مُحَمَّدًا صَلَى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَآلِهِ وَسَلَّمَ نِعْمُ الرَّسُولِ. And know that this messenger, Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wasallam, he's the best of prophets. وأن أمير المؤمنين علي بن أبي طالب وأولاده الأئمة 11 نعم الأئمة. And know that Ali and the children that come from his progeny, they're the best of leaders. Know that before we leave you, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is with you. And know that you followed on the best path, the path of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and his family, the Ahlul Bayt. Peace and blessings be upon them. And every time, and I attend a lot of these in my work and my sort of clerical clergy role more often than I'd like, or perhaps it's a good reminder. Every time that these lines are recited, where we're reminding the deceased that, again, that this God of yours is this loving God. He's the best of gods. He's this caring God. He is the one who is covering you in His mercy at this given moment. It allows for this sort of unique sense of contentment to fall on anyone and everyone in that gathering. Because there's people wailing, there's crying, and they're losing a loved one at that moment. And it's hard. It's hard naturally, right? When we experience loss and we experience grief. But at the end of the day, if we know and we see that there is some bigger sort of purpose to our existence at that moment. And we know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, at the end of the day, this is part of His law, that we transition. And sometimes these transitions are challenging and they're difficult. These lines, at the very least, they offer a bit of contentment to the heart that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He's not, allowing for someone's life to be passed in vain. There's some bigger purpose. There's some bigger picture that sometimes we don't necessarily see all of those things. And when you take a look at the story of Yusuf alayhi salam, it's amongst the best examples that demonstrate to us this very reality. Yusuf alayhi salam, from a young age, like we know now, as we've been taking a look at for the last several weeks, is thrown into this well by his brothers. He is so beloved by his father. Treated in this way, what happens? That there is this, caravan that comes and they pick him up. Right? And they have absolutely no use for him, not having any idea of what this young man's potential is. They don't know that he's the son of Yaqub. They don't know that he has been divinely inspired with knowledge from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They don't know that this little kid who is God knows how many years old, 6, 7, 8 years old, can interpret dreams or do really, really incredible things. They see him and they pick him up and they look at him and they say, we have no worth for this kid, but maybe we can make some money off of him. And then what happens? They sold him. And what did they sell him for? What did we say much earlier? They sold him for a nominal amount of wealth, some insignificant, huh? Thaman al-qalil. Yeah. They sold him for a worthless amount of wealth. And he was, of course, purchased by the sort of political elite. And they saw him and they looked at him and they said, maybe we can utilize him to help out around the house. He's just a kid, As a child, normally when they wanted to purchase a slave, for instance, they would seek toward purchasing someone who's older, who has some strength, who can give, some sort of power, authority, some sort of, responsibility to, but just a kid. Or maybe we take him as a son, as is mentioned. And transition after transition after transition after transition, and exam after trial and after tribulation of Yusuf alayhi salam, now he's in this situation. He's in this situation, and as we're going to see today, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't pull him out of his difficulties just yet. So let's go back to these ayat. So again, these two young men, they come to him and they say, "Oh Yusuf, oh our sort of fellow inmate, tell us what these dreams mean." And then he introduces himself and he introduces Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to them. واتبعت ملة آباء إبراهيم وإسحاق ويعقوب ما كان لنا أن نشرك بالله من شيء ذلك من فضل الله علينا وعلى الناس ولكن أكثر الناس لا يشكرون. Verses 38, 39, 40, he begins to tell them about worshiping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but look at the way that he does so. Like we talked about last week, he does so in a gentle way. He does so in a caring way. He does so in some sort of compassionate way in order to get them to think, in order for them to get them to kind of see the bigger picture. That perhaps maybe there's an opportunity for them to see some truth beyond what it is that I am, beyond what it is that I'm saying. Udu ila sabila rabbik bil hikmati wal maw'idatil hasana, as God says in the Holy Quran in chapter 16, verse 125. He says, bring people to the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but do so in a wise manner. Do so by utilizing beautiful language. Don't be so aggressive with them. Find ways to explain to them and to teach them and to communicate to them, but being really, really careful with your, with your methodology by which you speak. In Islamic law, it's an obligation that we perform what is known as amr bil ma'ruf and nahy anil munkar, to enjoin others to good and to forbid them from evil. But if you go and take a look at, our books of Islamic law, there are conditions for how we should enjoin others to good and conditions for how we should forbid them from evil. If we see someone doing something wrong, you can't just go to them and, for instance, slap that, haram sandwich that they're about to eat from their hand and let it fall to the floor, right? You go to them and you only speak to them if you feel, first of all, that they're going to be receptive to what you have to say. Otherwise, you find other ways, to communicate to them. You see someone not praying, but if you tell them, hey, I think you should start praying, people might turn back the opposite way, right? And say, screw you, I don't want to pray. Why should I listen to you? So find another way, right? Exhaust every opportunity to communicate to them in a way that they see beauty in the action that they are, or that you're inclining them to perform. So again, going back to the way that Yusuf alayhi salam is now speaking to them. All they did was come to him and they say, Yusuf, can you interpret these dreams for us? Yet he weaves in and out by telling them, this is the Lord of my forefathers, the Lord of Ibrahim alayhi salam. He's the one who's given me this power. Every opportunity he got in order to teach others about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he did just that. Even in that moment, if we rewind just a little bit, when Zulaykha was courting Yusuf alayhi salam in that room where she had closed the door, he had an opportunity to remind her of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Even in that moment, he didn't waste that opportunity. Until finally, in verse number 41, he begins to finally now explain the interpretation of these dreams. He says, Ya sahibi as-sijn, أما أحدكما فيسقي ربه خمرا وأما الآخر فيسلب فتأكل الطير من رأسه قضي الأمر الذي فيه تستفتيان. What is that coming from? Is that from my phone? Oh, it's fine. He says, "Oh, my two brothers in prison. As for one of you, as for you, you shall be tasked with the responsibility to give drink to the king. And as for the other," he tells him that you will be crucified. You'll be crucified for deceiving the king. فَتَأْكُلُ الطَّيْرُ مِنْ رَأْسِهِ. If you recall, when you go back to verse number 36, these two individuals, they came with two different dreams. One of them said, "Oh Yusuf, I saw myself pressing wine. I saw myself making wine. I saw myself pressing grapes in order to make wine." And the other one said, "I saw myself carrying bread on my head, and there were birds eating from that bread." So tell us what these dreams mean. He says, for the one who was pressing, and making wine, you will be tasked with the responsibility to serve drink to the king. And for the other one, your job, your responsibility, as well as our commentary say the same thing, that his job was to bring food to the king, but he sought to deceive him, or he sought to, do something. And eventually, he was crucified. After Yusuf alayhi salam, just as a quick side note, is mentioned in one of our ahadith, that after Yusuf alayhi salam told them that this is what's going to happen to you, you're going to be killed. This one who was told that he's going to be crucified, he went to Yusuf alayhi salam and he says, you know what? I didn't really have that dream. I was just messing around, So he says, too late, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has decreed this for you. Again, meaning that it wasn't just the interpretation of a dream, but Yusuf alayhi salam had some other unique knowledge of the unseen. Okay. So he interprets these dreams. What happens thereafter? Verse number 42. وقال الذي ظن أنه ناج منهما واذكروني عند ربك فأنساه الشيطان ذكر ربه فلبث في السجن بضع سنين. Verse number 42 is sort of oftentimes very misunderstood. How many of you have it in front of you right now? Yeah? Why don't you read me the translation that you have?
Then he said to the one he knew would survive, "Mention me in the presence of your master." But Satan made him forget to mention Joseph to his master, so he remained in prison for several years.
Okay. What else? We have a different...
I believe somewhere it says, and he said to the one whom he knew would go free, "Mention me before your master." But Satan made him forget the mention to his master, and Joseph remained in prison for several years.
Anyone else have a different...
It also says, kind of an alternative,
Yeah.
that Shaitan made Nabi Yusuf forget the remembrance of his Lord,
Yeah.
as to ask of his Lord's help instead of others.
Yeah. So what's the difference? What's the big difference in this? Who's the one who is forgetting? Right? وَقَالَ لِلَّذِي ظَنَّ أَنَّهُ نَاجٍ مِّنْهُمَا اذْكُرُونِي عِنْدَ رَبِّكَ. So he said to the one who was going to survive, meaning the one who was responsible for bringing drink, mention my name to your Lord. Who's the Lord here in question? The king. He says, when you go back, if you get freed from this prison before me, remember to mention my name, because I did this favor for you. You asked me to interpret your dream, so I'm interpreting your dream. So when you get out of this prison, and you're going to get out before me, then remind the king about me. Don't let me rot in this prison, in other words. فَأَنْسَاهُ الشَّيْطَانِ ذِكْرَ رَبِّهِ. So Shaitan caused him to forget the remembrance of his Lord. Some would argue that Yusuf alayhi salam, because he's asking this inmate of his for a favor, saying, "Hey brother, remember to give, to put in a good word for me when you get out," because he didn't ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala instead, meaning that he forgot his Lord. He didn't say, "Oh Allah, get me out of this prison." That because Yusuf alayhi salam forgot and asked someone else to do a task for him, right, as opposed to asking God directly, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala extended his prison sentence. You follow what I'm saying? So he's saying that it's, again, some would argue, that it is better if Yusuf had asked God, oh Allah, get me out of prison, save me from this trial that I'm in, that God would have saved him. But because he utilized an intermediary and said, hey, friend of mine, go and give a good mention to the king and get me out of here, that God postponed his prison sentence. And according to our ahadith, first of all, whenever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or in the Arabic language, it says bid as-sinin, it means less than 10 years, in amount of years. And according to our ahadith, it was 7 years. So 7 years, the extension of Yusuf's sort of prison sentence, again, according to some, because Yusuf forgot or he failed to ask God directly. You follow what I'm saying? This goes against many of our ahadith and our understanding of the infallibility of the prophets of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Which is why I mentioned this, because more likely it is that when God says فَأَنْسَاهُ الشَّيْطَانُ ذِكْرَ رَبِّهِ, that shaitan caused him to forget the mentioning of it to his Lord. It was the inmate himself who, after he got out of prison, he forgot to mention to the king that, hey, there's this Yusuf in prison, he knows how to interpret dreams, he helped me, or just, he's a good guy, help him out over here, let's get him out of prison. You follow what I'm saying? It's not such that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala extended it because there's no sin, or there's no issue with asking someone else, for a favor, so to say, or to utilize someone as an intermediary. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in other words, has caused his universe to live a system or whereby we are bound by a system of sort of causes and effects. And we need people many a times for us to reach our potentials and our goals. You follow what I'm saying over here? I'm not confusing this ayah of the Quran, sort of off, debated. فَأَنْسَاهُ الشَّيْطَانُ ذِكْرَ رَبِّهِ فَلَبِثَ فِي السِّجْنِ بِضْعَ سِنِينَ. Okay. So this guy, he gets out of prison. He resumes his responsibility of, bringing drink to the king whenever the king wanted it. And for another 7 years, Yusuf alayhi salam is in prison. Why does God do that to his most beloved creations? Yusuf. Why? So many people ask this question. Why is it, we talked about this briefly last week, why is it that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala puts us through all of these trials and tribulations in the ways that He does?
I know C.S. Lewis had this, it was in the book that you had mentioned, like A Grief Observed, how the line was, God wasn't testing me because God already knew, God was testing me because I didn't know.
Beautiful. What does that mean?
So, in the context of the book, I think C.S. Lewis was talking about how, he went through the trial that C.S. Lewis went through was that his wife had died and his faith was really shaken. But it wasn't until his faith was shaken that he realized how important it was to him. And so, in the end, God knew the strength of his faith, but, he himself didn't know. So, in a way, it's possible that Yusuf, for all the knowledge that he had, maybe he also didn't know the strength of his faith until he was put through the test.
I think for us as an individual, right, as a fallible individual, God puts us through these examinations. And how many times when we're going through hardship do we actually turn back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? Most, people who come and sit and talk to me in my office, they tell me, I'm going through this thing, but I've really sort of increased, or I'm really on top of my prayers now, Someone that was just talking to her just 2 weeks ago, and she said that, I was never part of faith, faith, religion, the last thing in my mind, at the end of the day. But this really horrific thing happened to her, and she was explaining to me, and she said, and the only thing that I find comfort in now is in knowing that, a few more hours is salah time again, I find contentment in that. I find peace in that. There's something beautiful about that. And so many people are drawn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in difficult times, right? It's a reality that so many human beings experiences, or their faith elevates at a time when they're going through a difficulty. And C.S. Lewis, he realizes that. The first moment is, why is this happening to me? But then later on, after sort of, navigating the situation, like many other people, they realize, wait a minute, like this, there's something in this, right? There's some beauty in this. in this worship. On another level, for the prophets of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, God seeks toward raising their rank. And the way that He does that is He tests their capacity to take more. The more that they can take, the more that their station is elevated. Similarly, like a human being, any one of us. Al-mu'min huznun fi qalbih wa bishrun ala wajh. That the believer is going through trials in their heart. They're going through difficulty and they're in a state of grief. But on their face, they don't show it. They're content. They know that all of this is temporary and all of this comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So over here, Yusuf alayhi salam, he takes it. And he takes it. But at the end of the day, God will always find a way out. وَمَن يَتَّقِ اللَّهِ يَجْعَلْ لَهُ مَخْرَجًا. God says in the Holy Quran that the one who has, God consciousness, God will always get us out. وَيَرْزُقْهُ مِنْ حَيْثُ لَا يَحْتَسِبُ. And He will grant you blessing after blessing in ways that you could have never perceived. He'll always get us out of the difficulty and of the hardship. And we'll see this as well later on in the story of Yusuf, how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions that. But to become king in the way that Yusuf becomes king, where everyone is subservient to him, alayhi salam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had to put him through a little bit of tribulation. But he didn't complain. He didn't say, "Oh Allah, why are you doing this to me?" He took it, realizing that all of this is what God wants for him. فَلَبِثَ فِي السِّجْنِ بِضْعَ سِنِينَ. So these two fellow inmates of his, they leave prison. And they forget to mention Yusuf alayhi salam to the king. Several years later, وَقَالَ الْمَلِكُ إِنِّي أَرَى سَبْعَ بَقَرَاتٍ سِمَانٍ يَأْكُلُهُنَّ سَبْعٌ إِجَافٌ وَسَبْعَ سُنبُلَاتٍ خُضْرٍ وَأُخَرُ يَابِسَاتٍ يَا أَيُّهَا الْمَلَأُ أَفْتُونِي فِي رُؤْيَايَ إِن كُنتُمْ لِلرُّؤْيَا تَعْبُرُونَ. Verse number 43. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that one day the king, now we're talking years later, right? Yusuf is still in prison. The king, again, if we just take one step back for a moment, if you recall when we talk about how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, explains stories, it's exactly like how a movie would be filmed, right? It just moves to another scene, right? We don't know what Yusuf alayhi salam had to go through those next several years in prison, right? In fact, the hadith tell us 7 years, but it doesn't mention it in the Quran deliberately. But we know that there was a period of time, years, that passed by. We don't know what he had to experience, what he had to endure, what other trials and tribulations that he had to, deal with, who he had to meet otherwise while he was in that prison. But we move on to the next scene, so to say. One day the king says, "I saw in my dream that there were 7 fat cows. They were being eaten by 7 skinny cows. And I saw 7 green ears of corn, and others that were dry. Oh, fellow sort of ministers in my court, tell me what this dream means, if any of you can interpret dreams." So he has this sort of strange, odd, dream at this moment. And he tells all these ministers of his, yes men, so to say, which one of you guys can, interpret this for me? قَالُوا أَضْغَاثُ أَحْلَامٍ. They say, "Oh king, this is a bunch of nonsense, virtually. All of this random stuff in your dream, don't worry about it. وَمَا نَحْنُ بِتَأْوِيلِ الْأَحْلَامِ بِعَالِمِينَ. And anyway, we're not really into the interpretation of dreams. We don't know. So don't worry about it anyway." And at this moment, what happens? That young man who was then in the prison with Yusuf alayhi salam, وَقَالَ الَّذِي نَجَى مِنْهُمَا وَادَّكَرَ بَعْدَ أُمَّةٍ أَنَا أُنَبِّئُكُمْ بِتَأْوِيلِهِ فَأَرْسِلُونَ. So in one of those 2 prisoners, that young man, who was responsible now for the drink, bringing water and bringing wine and bringing whatever to the king, he's listening to this scene unfold and he says, wait a minute. He says, "I have the answer to your question." He says, "Can you excuse me for a couple of minutes? I know where I can get the answer from." So he leaves and he goes into the prison. "Yusuf, O truthful one, أفتنا في 7 بقرات سمان يأكلهن سبع إجاف وسبع سنبلات خضر وأخر يابسات لعلي أرجع إلى الناس لعلهم يعلمون. So he rushes to him and he gets into the prison and he sees Yusuf alayhi salam in this prison. And he says, "Oh Yusuf, I know you have this ability to interpret dreams. Remember what you did for me a couple of years ago?" Yusuf could have said, for lack of a better word, he wouldn't say it like this. Really, screw you, man. Like, you forgot about me for years and I'm here in this prison. What does he say? He doesn't say anything. He comes to him and he says, "Oh Yusuf, please tell me that, what do you say if there were 7 fat cows who were eaten by these 7 skinny ones, and there were 7 sort of green ears of corn and others that were dry, and just what does this whole scene mean so I can go back and tell everyone?" Yusuf alayhi salam, he responds to him. How do you think he would respond to him? He just answers the question. He answers the question without throwing it back in his face. He's not asking for any more favors here. قال تزرعون 7 سنين دأبا فما حسدتم فذروه في سنبله إلا قليلا مما تأكلون. In verse number 47, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he quotes Yusuf. He says, you should, grow your crops for the next 7 years, and eat as very little as possible. In other words, that there's potential, there's going to be famine, there's going to be, a serious situation over here. So start to conserve as much as you can at this moment. Over here, what is so unique again is that Yusuf alayhi salam could have responded in any way. But again, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is testing him even in that moment. And it's really, really difficult many a times when you have someone who you don't necessarily want to offer, your support to them. You don't want to be kind to them. You don't want to, do a favor for them. But they're standing in front of you and they're asking you for help. How are we going to respond? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if Yusuf alayhi salam had just turned away, if he had pretended like he was sleeping, if he had, done something different, we justify for ourselves so many times why I shouldn't go. If I see someone, I'm going to pretend like I'm busy right now. I'm going to walk the other way, because I don't have to deal with this individual, because they're going to come and ask me for this, or they're going to come and ask me for that, or whatever it might be. Yusuf alayhi salam, again, he does it with a smile on his face. He's not concerned. And over here, this was also the means by which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala delivers him now, right? And saves him from this difficulty. Sometimes biting your tongue, sometimes being patient in a moment of rage or an anger is the moment whereby Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can facilitate for you things that you could have never imagined. So at this moment, he continues. In verse number 48, first of all, ثم يأتي من بعد ذلك سبع شداد يأكلن ما قدمتم لهن إلا قليلا مما تحسنون ثم يأتي من بعد ذلك عام فيه يغاث الناس وفيه يعصرون. So in verses number 47 to 48 to 49, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is quoting Yusuf alayhi salam, and we'll talk about this more in detail next week, about how that the king should start to preserve the crops, because of this famine that's going to take place some years later. And in verse number 50, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he quotes the king, وَقَالَ الْمَلِكُ تُونِ بِهِ فَلَمَّا جَاءَهُ الرَّسُولُ قَالَ أَرْجِعْ إِلَى رَبِّكَ فَاسْأَلْهُ مَا بَالُ النِّسْوَةِ اللَّاتِي قَطَعْنَ أَيْدِيَهُنَّ إِنَّ رَبِّي بِكَيْدِهِنَّ عليم. We'll stop over here, but in verse number 50, the king, this individual who's bringing drink to the king, who was in the company of Yusuf, this initial inmate, he goes back to the king and explains to him the interpretation of the dream. And then the king says, "Bring Yusuf back to me." It is said that he went back to Yusuf alayhi salam, and he asked him, Yusuf alayhi salam asks him, he says, "Before I come back, I want you to go back to the king and tell him to go and ask those women in the first place who was responsible, meaning I need to prove my innocence now before I go back. If I'm going to go back, I'm going to go back on my own terms, so to say now. So go and ask them, go and ask the king to go and find out, am I really guilty of that which I was put into prison in the first place?" We'll talk about this next week, insha'Allah ta'ala. But in summary, I'll conclude with this. Again, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, sometimes we ask Him for certain things. And we don't necessarily get what it is that we want, only many years later to realize that we get something far better. And in addition to that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I know I say this all the time, and I know you hear this all the time, and not to sound cliche at all, but at the end of the day, we are worshiping a God, and we are in a state of subservience to this God, and in a state of submissiveness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who wants what is best for His creation. If we follow the outline by which He has taught us to live life, via law, via ethics, fulfilling our responsibility to community and to others, God has His way of facilitating things in a very unique manner, right? We don't necessarily see it apparent to the eye all the time, but God, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there is this world of the unseen that is at play consistently at any and at every given moment. I'll leave you with this example that one of my teachers, he narrated some years back in a lesson when I was studying in the seminary. He says that one day there was this man who had come to him and told him that during the regime of under Saddam Hussein, that he was put into prison for being very outspoken, like against the government. He says, and one day we were in like the prison cell, and all of the guards, they were like, speaking like really loudly at the time of prayers, and they were like, just causing this big, huge commotion. And we were put into prison, me and all of these other sort of like religious folk, students of the seminary and whatever, into sort of one area in this prison. And they knew that when it was time for prayers to kind of give us a hard time, or, so that we weren't able to focus and whatnot. So he says that, after we finished our prayers, I like stood like, at the corner of this prison cell, and I started screaming at them. And I was like, you guys are so disrespectful. You guys are like awful human beings. And, I went off on them. I lost my kind of, my composure at that moment. And I let it all out. He says, anyway, that night finished. The next day, there was this, prison guard who came to me and said, you're the one who was screaming at us yesterday? And he says, yeah, that was me. He says, okay, come with me. He says that he was taken into like this room of like this like really, really big, like, general or whatever, commander of the army or whatever it was. And he says, why were you saying all of those things to us yesterday? He says, do you know what we can do to you? We can like torture you. We can like kill you. We can, destroy your family, And he says, you know what? But you guys are terrible people. And he lost it. He was, he's like, I don't really care at this point. You guys are terrible, and you're treating us so harshly, and this is so on and so forth. He says, to people like you, we kill you, right? And we send your decapitated body back to your families. Was their sort of methodology back in that day. So he says, do to me, as you please. Doesn't matter at this point. So the guard tells him, he says, you know what? I'm going to let you go free. Go back home. He says, what are you talking about? He says, normally, to an individual who speaks like the way that you do, again, I would kill them on the spot. He said, but you, I'm sending you back home. Go back to your family. So he says, like, what are you talking about? He says, I'm going to let you free after I tell you this really, really quick anecdote, and then, you're exiting the prison, and I'm never going to see you ever again for the rest of my life. He says, sure. He says, you don't remember me, do you? He says, no. He says, a few years ago, I was a much smaller sort of figure in the army, and I bumped into you in the streets of Karbala of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. He says, I was working in that area as a police officer or whatever it was, and my car had broken down. And I needed a ride to get to to get to wherever I needed to be. And I approached you because you were like, seemed like a nice guy. You seemed like you were from the town. You seemed like, you could help me out. And I told you, hey, like, do you mind giving me and my brother a ride? We need to get to work. If we don't, we're going to we're going to lose our jobs. We're going to get into a lot of trouble. We have whatever issues. And you graciously, gave us a ride to wherever we needed to be. I got to my place of employment, and slowly I was able to ascend to the place that I'm in now. because you did that favor for me, I'm not going to kill you right now. Go back to your family. So he says, okay, get me out of here. My teacher is narrating that one man he came and told him this. Imagine, sometimes Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you don't know, but when we do some really small deeds that we don't necessarily realize, what the potential outcome it can have in the long term, when we do something sincere in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, God facilitates again in ways that we could have never imagined. Throughout the story of Yusuf alayhi salam, even throughout our own life, if we think about it, everything that we do, at any given moment, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is facilitating for us on the back end. And that's what we have to remember and be cognizant of and recognize. And if we bear through these things patiently, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, again, will find us a way out of the difficulties and the tribulations that we deal with. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for tawfiq. Walhamdulillah rabbil alameen. Wa sallallahu ala Muhammadin wa ala tayyibin at-tahirin.